Timbuktu's treasures attacked, and new tensions over the South China Sea. Next on The Line. This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. A radical militia in northern Mali has been destroying Muslim holy sites in Timbuktu. The city's historic shrines are on the United Nations list of the world's most important cultural heritage sites. But the Islamic militia attacking the historic tombs and mosques have declared that, quote, the destruction is a divine order. Will any of Timbuktu's treasures survive? I'll ask my guest. Ishan Tharoor is a writer with Time magazine who's been covering the destruction in Timbuktu. Welcome, Ishan. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
What are these mosques and tombs and shrines in Timbuktu? When were they built?
Well, Timbuktu, its heyday was roughly between the 13th and 17th centuries. It was a city very much at the confluence then of trans-Saharan trade routes of salt, gold, even slaves, and it went from being a political and economic center to being a cultural center, a city that's now known for its 333 saints. These are Muslim holy men. It's a city of myriad libraries possessing 700,000 famous old texts. It was a city of learning, and it was a city from which Islam spread across much of West Africa.
So how much of the shrines and the protected sites there in Timbuktu have been destroyed?
By last accounting, roughly from the reports we're seeing, around at least half. And the shrines that we're talking about are in particular tombs of saints. The militia that's responsible for all this, the Ansar Din, are a Salafist, very puritanical sect who believe that worshipping and veneration of Sufi saints is idolatry. So a lot of what's being targeted are these tombs in particular, not so much the mosques, but even certain mosques in Timbuktu possess tombs, and they have been defiled as well.
And so you have Sufi Islam and this Salafist version of Islam. How long and how long has this dispute been going on among the different kinds of Islam over what is the proper way to practice the faith?
Well, you know, it's a question of doctrine and ideology that's not just contained, that's not just fought over within Islam. Every major faith has its more puritanical creed and its more syncretic heterodox strain. So the clash between Sufis and Wahhabis or Salafists or whatever you want to call them, it's an old one. It's not something that is new. But what we're seeing right now, especially given the ascendance of sort of militant Islam and especially more fundamentalist groups that are willing to carry out this kind of violence, is a worrying trend of Salafists and Wahhabist groups, be they in Pakistan or Libya or Egypt, and now in Mali, targeting these holy sites.
And perhaps we see some of the weapons that had been in Libya spilling into this conflict.
Indeed. Yes, absolutely. The Ansar Din, they told us that in Timbuktu itself, one of their leaders told us that they possess Russian surface-to-air missiles, they have U.S. Stinger rockets, and these are all weapons looted from the arsenals of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya.
And what does this say about the conflicts that have been going on in Africa and in northern Africa in particular over religion?
Well, it's hard to tell. Ansar Din itself is linked to Al-Qaeda, specifically Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, the North African wing of Al-Qaeda. But much of what we're seeing right now has been enabled by a particular set of political events that took place in Mali. First, of course, the resurgence of the ethnic Tuareg insurgency in Mali's north that has been very much enabled by the fall of the Gaddafi regime and the opening up of its arsenals, as we just discussed. But also a coup in Mali itself. Mali, for many years, has been one of the more stable democracies in the region and considered a success story. But the political chaos that the coup brought about, plus the emboldened strength of the insurgency, has led to this to this kind of confluence of events.
Now, the UN and UNESCO in particular has decried the destruction of these temples and shrines and mosques, and yet they haven't been able to do anything. What power does the UN have in this kind of situation?
Sadly, not very much. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General, has made all the right noises. UNESCO has issued many statements now about what's happening. And as well as, the Fatou Bensouda, the new chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, she has said that this act is tantamount to a war crime. But as long as there are no boots on the ground, and the West African governments are contemplating sending in some kind of expeditionary intervention force, until that happens, we can't tell. And the situation in Mali is so chaotic and so in flux right now, it's hard to imagine what would necessarily tip the balance and make this militia stop.
And aside from the violence, so much of what has underpinned the Timbuktu economy, the region there, has been tourism traditionally. Even when the violence goes away, what will be left of the cultural sites that once underpinned the economy in the region?
Well, it's very hard to tell right now. Many people from Timbuktu, even the mayor in the latest report I've seen, have fled the city. Sharia law has been imposed there. Of course, no tourists are going there. No tourists are going to Mali in general. A bunch of hotels in the capital city, Bamako, have recently suspended service. So it's a very grim situation. And Timbuktu in particular is such an exotic city in the global imagination, and it's been long the destination of backpackers. It's hard to see right now how quickly it could get back on its feet.
Is this a signal that there's likely to be more religious conflict and violence in Africa in general?
That's the fear. I mean, there's a belt sort of spanning from northern West Africa, the Sahel, all the way to Somalia with Al-Shabaab, where you do see a kind of resurgence of Islamists and political Islam that has very extreme undertones, as well as militant manifestations that seem to have links to larger terror networks around the world. So yes, it is very much in keeping with general worries right now over the ascendance of a type of militant Islam in this region, and no longer say the type that we've been accustomed to see in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
And is there likely to be any greater effort by local international groups, which is to say African organizations, to try to stop the violence?
We'll see. The leaders of various neighboring West African nations have been meeting. There are tentative plans for some kind of peacekeeping force to be put into place. But this is still rather nascent, and there are a lot of, as you can tell, the international community beyond West Africa has very little appetite for any sort of intervention right now.
What are the prospects for what's left of the treasures of Timbuktu to survive at this point? The situation looks grim. The city itself is a city of mud-packed brick structures. And even if there was increased hostilities in the city, much of the remaining structures would be at risk. Beyond the mosques and tombs, there are also, as I said earlier, myriad libraries with lots of very precious ancient texts that have been researchers in the past have been trying to digitize them and document them. But now, of course, those efforts have been stalled. So it's not just the structures that are in danger, it's the whole tradition, the whole intellectual culture that used to exist there that is at risk right now. And is that the particular goal of the radical militias, is to not just destroy the sites, but rather to destroy that culture? Absolutely.
It's a culture that was tolerant, that was steeped in all sorts of syncretic, heterodox beliefs, that had a strain of mysticism to it, that really, was very much in tune with the local cultures around it, and it has very little to do with the kind of puritanical hate of people like Wahhabists and Salafists and this militia.
Well, Ishant Tharoor of Time Magazine, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. A dispute over the South China Sea has been brewing. China claims ownership of much of the waters, which stretch from Taiwan to Malaysia, causing conflict with countries such as the Philippines. Last week, a meeting of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations came unraveled over the dispute. How serious is the conflict becoming? I'll ask my guests. Andrew Quinn, U.S. foreign policy correspondent for the Reuters News Service, and Christian Lowe, managing editor for news at U.S. News and World Report. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So, Andrew Quinn, what is this dispute over?
Well, the dispute's over territory, but it's also over resources. The South China Sea, which stretches over this large area stretching south of China, has a lot of oil and gas reserves. I believe some people estimate that it may have as much as close to Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. So that's a lot of potential money. And it's also over shipping lanes. I think shipping over through South China Sea routes carries about $5 trillion a year. That's about half of the annual tonnage of shipping. So who controls the South China Sea really has a pretty strong economic grip on the region of Asia as a whole. So that's what I think it's about.
Christian Lowe, are these gas and oil resources, or is this something where the technology's changed, become better, easier to get at some of this stuff, and thus created a new problem?
Sure, I think it's both. The technology has changed as well as the demand for resources that China has. As it expands, as its economy grows, as its population's standard of living rises, the demand for natural resources increases, and that is pretty much the closest oil reserves or potential oil reserves they have to their territory, and therefore the lines of communication, the chains of supply are shorter. You know, the interesting thing is the countries that are primarily involved in this dispute are Vietnam and the Philippines, and both Vietnam and the Philippines have recently signed deals with oil exploration firms from Russia, the United States, and other countries to tap the oil in those waters. And so China is reinserting itself in this situation because, you know, they have a demand for those resources.
Now, Hillary Clinton, ahead of the ASEAN meeting where this was a central issue, she said, quote, "No nation can fail to be concerned by the increase in tensions, the uptick in confrontational rhetoric, and disagreement over resource exploitation." So how concerned is Secretary Clinton?
I think they're very concerned. I think it's a medium to long-term concern rather than they think of an explosion right around the corner. But what they're worried about is that the nations in the region do not have an apparatus for working out their differences. China, for its part, really likes to deal one-on-one with each of these small nations individually. And the United States and its allies in the region think that there should be a more multilateral approach to working out differences, a code of conduct, if you will, for how each nation behaves in the region. And the Chinese are resisting that.
Christian Lowe, so you had at this ASEAN meeting an effort to have a sort of a group way of dealing with resolving the problem, and then you had China peeling off one country in particular to try to keep there from being any sort of resolution here.
Right, the host country, Cambodia. And it's funny because, and Andrew brought this up earlier, you know, China's strategy has always been to deal one-on-one with countries in the region because, you know, they're usually small and obviously less powerful both militarily and economically than China. And so if they can peel away individually these countries, they'll be able to negotiate agreements in their favor. And with this situation, China did exactly that. They invested in the year running up to the ASEAN conference. They invested a lot of money into infrastructure in Cambodia. And therefore, Cambodia was pretty much beholden to China to block this settlement on the use of these resources. And it was sort of a multilateral agreement on how to deal with these kinds of disputes, and China drove a wedge between the alliance and it got the result they wanted.
And there was one funny thing actually in one of the meetings. Our reporters who were there said that when the Philippine foreign minister got up to start introducing this notion of a multilateral framework for the South China Sea, his microphone went dead, and everyone was looking around at each other and saying, well, how did the Cambodians said it was a mistake, but the Filipinos were not so sure.
Now, let's talk a little bit about where this fits in the relations that the U.S. has with China and the broader issue of this U.S. foreign policy pivot towards Asia that has been a central part of the Obama administration's foreign policy. The Chinese news service Xinhua said, quote, "Though China always exercises restraint and insists on diplomatic solutions to the disputes, some countries keep challenging China, which certainly has something to do with U.S. re-engagement in the region." So Christian Loh, the position from the state media organization in China is that this is being driven by the U.S. and its strategic pivot toward Asia.
Sure. I am not seeing a lot of evidence of that, obviously. You know, it's funny because though the Obama administration has decided it would, quote, pivot to Asia, there hasn't been a whole lot of evidence of that pivot so far. In fact, we're sailing an additional aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf, and for the first time in a very long time, we're going to have 2 aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf. So the Middle East still seems to be a focus of American military influence. I will say that this may have more to do with domestic politics in China than it does with America's pivot to the Pacific, because there's a leadership transition coming up in November, and this is like straight out of the playbook. Cause an international kerfuffle, make certain segments of the Chinese government look stronger and play off of each other. That's what a lot of analysts are saying right now.
Andrew Quinn, what's your sense of how this dispute affects the U.S. pivot toward Asia, to whatever extent it's actually happening, and to what extent does that pivot affect the dispute over the South China Sea?
Well, I think they're interrelated, obviously. I think that the Obama administration did take a sort of rhetorical decision to pivot toward Asia, and they are following through with a lot of official visits. You had Panetta, who was in the region last month. You had the Philippine president meeting Obama at the White House also last month. So they're trying to step up this engagement, which they perceived as having dropped off during the Bush administration. But I think when it comes to China, the U.S.-China relationship is so broad and covers so many different realms that one element of it, the South China Sea or currency disputes, is not going to upend the whole thing. But they do add to this constant sense of static between Beijing and Washington, and with both countries facing the possibility of a political transition, that static is always going to rise.
Christian Loh, how dangerous is this dispute, though? We saw in the last week that a Chinese Navy frigate ran aground in one of the contested areas of the South China Sea, which suggests that when you've got a lot of ships that are sort of contesting for who controls what area, you never know what's going to happen, whether it's somebody running aground or some ship running into a ship from another country, and these things can get out of hand.
I actually think that the more dangerous confrontation occurred with Japan recently. There were several Chinese maritime patrol boats that were in what Japan views as their waters around the Senkaku Islands. And this is forcing Japan to be a lot more assertive with its navy and its national security. Their constitution requires them to only use their military in self-defense, but they're starting to have to think about being more proactive about looking for Chinese submarines and keeping Chinese ships out of what they consider their economic waters. And the interesting thing is the U.S. is actually disengaging from Japan. We're moving a lot of our troops off of Japanese bases and out to Guam. So that's much further out in the Pacific and further away from China's sphere of influence as they see it. So I think China's playing an interesting strategic game here. I'm not sure how much of a larger confrontation with the United States this could cause, but certainly it really ratchets up tension in the region.
So this conflict with Japan and China in the East China Sea, where does that fit, Andrew, with then the South China Sea?
Well, I mean, it's the same sort of broad struggle over territorial claims. I think as far as the South China Sea goes, one of the main threats really to stability there is the threat to internal cohesion among Southeast Asian nations. I mean, the fact that this ASEAN meeting last week was unable to come up with a final communique, that's the first time that's ever happened in 45 years of history. And that shows how deep the divisions are within the ASEAN framework.
Now, there was some effort to say, both from Secretary of State and from the ambassador from the U.S. to ASEAN, that this was a good thing. It showed that these conflicts were being aired and were being dealt with in some way. Is that the real opinion within diplomatic circles, or is that just
I don't think so. I mean, I think when you have a big meeting and it isn't able to come up with a final statement, that shows you that there are serious unresolved problems at the root. And I think that the U.S. would much rather see ASEAN come together as a bloc and stand up to China as a bloc, which would then give the U.S. a partner in its effort to sort of push back against China's growing dominance in the region. But ASEAN has proved that it can't do that yet. So I think the worry is that the Chinese are successfully sort of dividing the group.
We've only got a few seconds left, but Christian Lowe, what are you going to be looking for in the coming months to see where this dispute is headed?
Well, I think we're actually going to be having to look more towards the Philippines and Vietnam. I mean, we saw some serious outreach from Secretary Clinton towards Vietnam. It's unpopular in some circles in the United States, but broadly popular. And I think that hedge will really help the United States position in the region. Also with the Philippines, I think we're going to see a lot more engagement, military engagement with them, some arms sales potentially. So I think those are going to be the hedges.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Andrew Quinn of Reuters and Christian Lowe of U.S. News and World Report, thanks so much for joining us. Before we go, I'd like to invite you to send us your questions or comments. You can reach us through our website at voanews.com/ontheline. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us again next week for On the Line.